Mercedes just dominated the Chinese Grand Prix, and now the FIA is investigating their engine. Not after a failure. After total control. A 1-2 finish. 0 mistakes. And something that should not happen under these rules? They never ran out of energy. Not once. While every other team was lifting, managing, losing power at the end of straights, Mercedes kept pushing. Flat out. Lap after lap. And in this new era of Formula One, that is not normal. Because energy is limited. Deployment is restricted. And every team hits that limit. Except, it didn't look like Mercedes did. And that's exactly why the FIA is now looking closer. Because if one team suddenly finds more efficiency, more consistency, more power than expected, there are only two possibilities. They understood something no one else did. Or, they are operating in a way the rules didn't fully anticipate. And if it's the second, this doesn't just affect one race. It could change the entire season. Because even a small clarification, even a tiny adjustment, can erase a massive advantage overnight. So the real question is not how Mercedes dominated China. The real question is, what exactly did they unlock that made the FIA step in? What makes this even more intense is how early this is happening. 2 races into a brand new era. And already, one team looks like they solved the system. Completely. Because China wasn't just a win. It was control. From the very first practice session, Mercedes was ahead. Not by a small margin. By a clear one. Comfortable. Consistent. Untouchable. And that's what made people inside the paddock uncomfortable. Because under new regulations, nobody is supposed to look that comfortable. Not yet. Teams are still learning. Still experimenting. Still discovering where the limits are. But Mercedes looked like they already knew. And that's where the first real suspicion begins. Because when a team finds performance this early, it usually means one of two things. They understood the rules better than everyone else. Or, they found something others haven't even considered. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the advantage Mercedes showed was not just speed. It was how that speed was delivered. Smooth, linear, predictable. No sudden drops. No visible clipping at the end of straights. And in this generation of cars, that is incredibly difficult to achieve. Because energy deployment is not infinite. Every team has to manage it. Carefully. You push too hard, you pay for it later in the lap. That's the trade-off. That's the system. But Mercedes didn't seem to follow that pattern. They pushed and kept pushing. Lap after lap. And that's exactly what raised eyebrows. Because when the system behaves too perfectly, people start asking why. Now here's something most viewers don't see. Teams don't just watch races. They analyze them. Deeply. Speed traces. Throttle application. Energy deployment curves. Everything is compared. And when one car shows a pattern that doesn't match the rest, it stands out immediately. Not publicly, but inside the garages. Inside the data rooms. And in China, Mercedes stood out. A lot. Because their energy curve looked different. Not wildly different. But enough. Enough to suggest that they might be operating the system more efficiently than expected. Or, differently. And that word, differently, is where problems begin. Because in Formula One, different is good. Until it becomes too effective. Then it becomes a question. Now add another layer. Consistency under pressure. Because it's one thing to be fast for a few laps. It's another thing to sustain that pace for an entire race. With tire wear. With temperature changes. With traffic. And Mercedes did exactly that. No drop. No instability. Just the same level, from start to finish. And that kind of consistency is what makes engineers nervous. Because it suggests control. Deep control. Over systems that are supposed to be limiting. Now connect that to the FIA. Because this is exactly what they monitor. Not just peak performance, but sustained behavior. How a system performs over time. How it reacts under stress. And whether that behavior fits within what is realistically achievable under the rules. If something looks too efficient, too stable, too repeatable, it gets flagged. Not as illegal, but as worth investigating. And that's where Mercedes is right now. Under observation. Not accused, but definitely noticed. Now here's the key detail. This kind of attention doesn't need proof to matter. Just the presence of doubt is enough to change everything. Because now, every lap Mercedes runs is being analyzed more closely. Every advantage is being questioned. Every gain is being studied. And that creates pressure. Not visible pressure, but internal. The kind that makes engineers second guess. The kind that makes teams more cautious. And in Formula One, Caution costs performance. So now the situation becomes very delicate. Because Mercedes has to keep pushing, while knowing they are being watched. They have to maintain that advantage, without crossing a line that might not even be clearly defined. And that balance is incredibly difficult to manage. Which leads to the real question. Not what Mercedes did in China, but how repeatable it is. Because if they show up at the next race, and look exactly the same, then they are simply ahead. But if something changes, if the car looks slightly more limited, if that perfect consistency disappears, then we will know that what we saw in China was not just performance. It was something that the sport itself is now trying to understand. But just when it seems like this is only about performance, another layer starts to emerge. And this one is far more dangerous for Mercedes. Because once the FIA begins to look deeper, it never stays quiet for long. Other teams notice. Engineers start asking questions. And suddenly, what was admiration turns into pressure. Real pressure. Because in Formula One, rivals don't accept what they don't understand. They challenge it. They push the FIA for answers. They demand clarity. And right now, Mercedes is the center of that attention. Now imagine what is happening behind the scenes. Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, all analyzing the same thing. Mercedes power delivery. Sector by sector. Straight by straight. Trying to find where the difference comes from. Because if they can't replicate it, they will try to restrict it. That's how this sport works. Now here's where the situation becomes critical. Because the FIA doesn't operate in isolation. They listen. They observe. They compare data across all teams. And if multiple teams start raising the same concern, the pressure increases. Not publicly, but internally. And that's when investigations become more serious, more detailed, more focused. Now connect that to what we saw in China. Mercedes didn't just win. They dominated in a way that looked effortless. And effortless performance is what creates suspicion. Because Formula One is not supposed to look easy. Not under these regulations. Not with these limits. Every team is fighting the system. Managing energy. Balancing performance. Dealing with compromises. Except, Mercedes didn't look like they were compromising. And that's exactly what makes this uncomfortable. Now here's the turning point. Because once the FIA identifies something unusual, they have options. They can let it continue. They can monitor it. Or, they can step in. Not with penalties, but with clarifications. Small changes in how the rules are interpreted. And those small changes have massive consequences. Because they force teams to adjust. And when a team is extracting maximum performance from a specific interpretation, any adjustment reduces that performance immediately. Now think about the impact. If Mercedes has built their advantage around a very precise way of managing energy, and the FIA limits that approach, even slightly, they don't just lose speed. They lose stability. They lose consistency. They lose the very thing that made them dominant. And that's when everything changes. Because dominance is fragile. It looks strong. Until something small shifts. And then, it disappears faster than expected. Now add another layer. Internal confidence. Because right now, Mercedes believes in their system. The car works. The data supports it. The results confirm it. But the moment external pressure increases, that confidence gets tested. Engineers start asking different questions. Drivers feel the tension. Decisions become more cautious. And that's when performance starts to drop. Not dramatically, but enough. Always enough. Now imagine the next race. All eyes on Mercedes. Every lap compared to China. Every straight analyzed. Every sign of energy drop watched closely. Not just by fans, but by the FIA. By rival teams. By everyone. And that kind of scrutiny changes everything. Because now, Mercedes is not just racing. They are proving something. That their performance is clean, sustainable, repeatable, under pressure. And that is a very different challenge. Because winning once is not enough anymore. Now they have to show that they can do it again. With everyone watching. With the FIA analyzing. With rivals ready to react. So this is the real moment. Not the victory in China. Not the investigation itself. But what happens when both collide? Because if Mercedes shows up and looks just as dominant, then they send a clear message. They are ahead, and nothing changes. But if even a small part of that advantage disappears, if the car looks slightly more limited, if the consistency breaks, then we will know that what we saw in China was not just dominance. It was a peak, a moment, right before the sport pushed back. And yet, even with all this pressure building, there is one final detail that could decide everything. Because this is not just about what Mercedes is doing. It's about how the FIA chooses to respond. And that decision will define the entire season. Because Formula One has seen this before. A team finds something. Something small. Something clever. Something that gives them an edge. At first, it looks like genius. Then, it becomes dominance. And eventually, it becomes a problem. Not because it's illegal, but because it changes the balance too much. And when that happens, the FIA always steps in. Not aggressively. Not publicly. But precisely. They adjust the interpretation. They redefine the limits. They bring the performance back into range. And when they do, the team that was ahead suddenly isn't. Now imagine that happening to Mercedes. Right now. At the start of a new era. When everything is still being defined. Because if their advantage depends on a specific way of using the system, and that way gets restricted, even slightly, the effect is immediate. Not gradual. Immediate. Because they are not just losing power. They are losing the way they generate that power. And that's much harder to recover. Now here's the part that makes this even more intense. Because the rest of the grid is waiting, watching, ready to react. If Mercedes keeps their advantage, everyone will chase it, copy it, adapt to it. But if the FIA limits it, everyone benefits, except Mercedes. And that's why this moment is so critical. Because it's not just about one team. It's about the direction of the sport. Now bring it back to the drivers. Because in the end, they feel everything first. If the car changes, even slightly, they notice. The balance shifts. The delivery feels different. The confidence drops. And in Formula One, confidence is everything. Because when a driver trusts the car, they push. When they don't, they hesitate. And hesitation is the difference between controlling a race and fighting to stay in it. Now imagine Antonelli and Russell going into the next race, after dominating China, but knowing that everything is being watched, that every advantage is being questioned, that the system might need to change. That uncertainty changes how you drive, even if you don't say it, even if you try to ignore it. It's there. And that's where dominance starts to crack. Not from the outside, from within. Now here's the final piece. Because everything we've seen so far leads to one unavoidable conclusion. China was not just a victory. It was a revelation. A moment where Mercedes showed their full potential. But also, a moment that triggered the entire sport to respond. The FIA, the rival teams, the media, everyone. And now, Mercedes has to prove something. Not just that they are fast, but that they can stay fast when the system around them starts to close in. Because that is the real challenge. Not finding performance, keeping it under pressure, under scrutiny, under changing conditions. So now, as we move to the next race, this is no longer just about speed. It's about survival at the top. Because if Mercedes shows up and looks just as dominant, then the message is clear. They are ahead, and the rest are chasing shadows. But if even a small part of that performance disappears, if the advantage shrinks, if the car looks just a little more normal, then we will know the truth. That what we saw in China was not just the start of dominance. It was the peak, right before everything pushed back.